Exactly 1 year had passed since that chaotic, terrifying Saturday morning in the driveway. I woke up early, entirely out of habit, and walked downstairs to the kitchen as the golden morning sun began to filter warmly through the large bay windows. I poured my coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, breathing in the rich, dark scent of the roasted beans.
I walked over to the front door, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and stepped out onto the wide porch. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I looked down the long stretch of the driveway. I no longer pictured the hired actor grabbing my arms, nor did I see Mark furiously waving his smartphone, desperately screaming about the strict prenuptial agreement.
Instead, I just saw a beautiful, ordinary driveway leading directly to a safe, loving home. Mark's malicious plan, driven entirely by his arrogance and his greed, had spectacularly backfired because he had fundamentally underestimated me. He assumed my quiet devotion was a sign of total weakness. He failed to realize that a woman who fights desperately to save her marriage will fight twice as fiercely to save herself when that marriage becomes a trap. Clause 8 had legally given me my financial freedom, but my emotional freedom was a prize I had bravely won entirely on my own. I took a slow, deep sip of my warm coffee, smiling up at the clear, boundless blue sky. I had lost a husband, but I had miraculously found my own unshakable voice. I turned around, walked back inside my bright, peaceful house, and gently closed the door, ready to beautifully paint the rest of my life. The morning sun used to feel like a promise, streaming warmly through the bay windows of our kitchen. Today, it just felt incredibly cold. I wrapped my thick cardigan tighter around my shoulders, staring at the back of my husband's head. Mark was typing furiously on his phone, his black coffee completely untouched and cooling rapidly on the marble counter. We had been married for 5 years, but looking at him right now, he felt like an absolute stranger sitting in my home. "Mark?" I asked softly, setting a plate of buttered toast near his hand. "Are you going to eat anything?" He didn't even bother to look up. "Busy, Clara. Some of us have actual fires to put out at work today." The casual dismissal stung, a familiar, heavy ache blooming deep in my chest. It wasn't a shout, nor was it aggressive, but the sheer apathy in his voice cut deeper than anger ever could. I sat across from him, gently tracing the rim of my own ceramic mug. Where had the man gone who used to leave sweet, sticky notes on the bathroom mirror? The man who promised me that our marriage would be a partnership built on unwavering support? Lately, our home felt more like a silent, emotional battleground. Every conversation was strictly transactional. Every shared look was strained and exhausting. I had tried everything, suggesting couples counseling, planning quiet weekend getaways, even just sitting him down to tearfully beg him to let me back in. But there was a thick, impenetrable wall around him now. He finally stood up, grabbing his leather briefcase without a second glance. "I'll be late tonight. Don't wait up." The front door clicked shut. I sat alone in the suffocating silence, unaware that this distance was actually a calculated strategy. I spent the rest of the morning organizing the study, a mundane household chore to keep my mind from spiraling into dark, anxious places. As I dusted the top wooden shelf, a heavy, leather-bound folder caught my eye, our marital documents. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it down, the golden lettering on the spine flashing in the dusty morning light. I opened it to the very first document we had signed together, even before our marriage certificate, the prenuptial agreement. I remembered the day we signed it so vividly. We were sitting in a pristine, glass-walled lawyer's office downtown. Mark had held my hand, looking deeply and lovingly into my eyes. "It's just a formality, Clara," he had murmured, his thumb gently brushing my knuckles. "My business partners need to know my assets are secure. It protects you too. It protects our future." I had trusted him completely. I skimmed the dense legal jargon now, my eyes landing on the section that had always made me slightly uncomfortable, the infidelity clause. It was brutally strict. If either party was caught being unfaithful, they would walk away with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no shared assets, not even a fraction of the joint savings. 0. Back then, I had laughed it off. The thought of either of us betraying the other seemed like a ridiculous, impossible fiction. But staring at the black ink today, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Mark's recent obsession with our bank accounts, his secretive late-night phone calls, the way he guarded his laptop, it all painted a terrifying picture. I closed the folder and pressed my hands to my face, fighting back a wave of tears. I refused to let paranoia ruin my sanity, but the seed of doubt had taken root. A few days later, the strange and unsettling occurrences began. It started with an eerie feeling of being watched. I would be out watering the blue hydrangeas in our front yard, and I'd catch a glimpse of an unfamiliar dark sedan idling at the end of our quiet cul-de-sac. Whenever I looked directly at it, the car would smoothly and quickly drive away. I told myself I was just being foolish, letting the emotional tension in my failing marriage manifest as suburban paranoia. Then came the peculiar incident at the local grocery store. I was simply reaching for a carton of almond milk when a handsome, ruggedly dressed man accidentally bumped his shopping cart hard into mine. He was overly apologetic, instantly flashing a rehearsed, dazzling smile. "I am so incredibly sorry," he said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. He lingered far too long, his eyes noticeably dropping to my diamond wedding ring before meeting my gaze again. "Please, can I buy you a cup of coffee to make up for my absolute clumsiness?" "No, thank you." "I'm married," I replied politely but firmly, gripping the handle of my cart and steering away. I felt his intense gaze on my back as I hurried down the aisle. It felt completely unnatural, like a poorly acted scene in a romantic movie. When I casually mentioned the strange encounter to Mark that evening over a tense, silent dinner, I expected him to be dismissive or perhaps mildly protective of his wife. Instead, his reaction was chillingly bizarre. He froze entirely, his silver fork hovering halfway to his mouth. A strange flicker of deep disappointment crossed his face. "You didn't talk to him?" Mark asked, his tone oddly strained. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. The unease from the grocery store lingered, wrapping around me like a damp, heavy blanket. Between Mark's bizarre disappointment and the dark sedan I kept seeing in our neighborhood, my sense of security within my own home was rapidly crumbling. Mark was rarely around to make me feel safe, always hiding behind the excuse of late-night board meetings. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I purchased a high-definition security camera system. It wasn't anything overly complex, just a sleek doorbell camera and a discreet motion sensor lens angled perfectly over our long driveway. I spent hours up on a step stool, meticulously drilling and mounting the devices myself, wiping sweat from my brow. I synced the live feed directly to my personal laptop, creating a hidden, password-protected folder to store the recordings. When Mark finally trudged through the front door past 10 o'clock that night, he didn't even notice the new lens glowing faintly in the dark. "Hey," I called out gently from the living room couch, closing my laptop. "Long day?" He sighed heavily, loosening his expensive silk tie and avoiding my eyes. "Exhausting. I'm going straight to bed, Clara. Don't bother warming up dinner." I watched his retreating back, feeling a profound, hollow sadness. I had installed the cameras to protect our home from strangers, but as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, I realized the most terrifying stranger was the man sleeping down the hall. I wanted so desperately to bridge the agonizing gap between us, but he was actively building the walls higher. I opened my laptop again, watching the empty, silent driveway on the screen, desperately looking for answers. 3 days after I installed the cameras, the supposedly accidental encounters escalated into something undeniably deliberate. I was out sweeping fallen autumn leaves from the front porch, enjoying the crisp, cool morning air, when a shadow fell over the pavement. I looked up, and my heart skipped a frantic beat. It was him. The ridiculously handsome, smooth-talking man from the grocery store aisle. This time, he was dressed in stylish athletic clothes, lightly jogging in place at the edge of my lawn. "Well, hello again," he called out, his voice practically dripping with artificial charm. He jogged up the driveway, closing the distance between us far too quickly. "I didn't realize you lived in this neighborhood."
"What a wonderful coincidence. It's a private driveway," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I gripped the wooden handle of the broom. "Please keep moving." Instead of apologizing, he took another step forward, flashing that same rehearsed, blinding smile. "Come on, a beautiful woman like you shouldn't be doing yard work all alone. Let me help you." Panic flared in my chest. Without another word, I dropped the broom, turned on my heel, and practically ran inside, locking the heavy oak door behind me. My breathing was ragged as I leaned against the wood. I immediately ran to the kitchen island, flipping open my laptop to check the driveway camera feed. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man wasn't jogging away. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of our driveway, staring intently at his smartphone. He typed a quick message, looked visibly frustrated, and finally turned to leave. This was no coincidence. He was waiting for a cue. Someone was sending him here. My hands shook violently as I folded Mark's laundry later that afternoon. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the jigsaw puzzle pieces scattered before me. The strict prenup, the sudden emotional freezing, the stranger in the driveway. I needed answers, but asking Mark directly would only result in another wall of frustrating silence or a gaslighting accusation of paranoia. As I picked up a pair of his gray wool trousers to hang, my fingers brushed against something stiff in the right pocket. I pulled it out. It was a crumpled white paper receipt from our shared bank's local branch. I smoothed it out on the ironing board, my eyes scanning the printed numbers. It was a withdrawal slip. 2 days ago, Mark had withdrawn a massive sum of cash, thousands of dollars, from our joint savings account. I had to sit down on the edge of the laundry basket, gasping for air as if I had been punched in the stomach. Mark handled all of our finances digitally. He openly mocked people who carried physical cash, claiming it was an outdated liability. Why would he need thousands of dollars in untraceable bills? Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, leaving hot, stinging trails down my cheeks. The betrayal wasn't just a sudden lack of love. It was a methodical, terrifying calculation. He wasn't having an affair. He was trying to frame me for one.
He was paying that actor to compromise me, to trigger that vicious infidelity clause, so he could walk away with everything we had built together over 5 years. I wiped my eyes fiercely, a new, fiery resolve hardening my shattered heart. If he wanted to play a ruthless game, I was going to rewrite the rules. Tears dried. I carefully folded the crumpled bank receipt and placed it exactly where I had found it in Mark's pocket. The overwhelming grief was still there, sitting like a heavy, suffocating stone in my chest, but it was now tightly wrapped in a protective layer of cold survival instinct. When Mark came home that evening, I played the part of the devoted, oblivious wife flawlessly. I served him a warm plate of pot roast, asked politely about his day, and smiled serenely when he gave his usual dismissive, irritated grunts. Every time he looked away, though, my eyes studied him, searching for the man I used to love. He was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless stranger scheming across my dining table. Inside, my mind was racing frantically. The driveway camera wasn't going to be enough. I needed to know exactly where that withdrawn cash went. The next morning, after he stepped into the shower, I slipped out the front door and crept into his parked SUV. My hands shook violently as I installed a tiny, high-definition dash cam.
I had bought it online months ago for a scenic road trip we never took, and it had been collecting dust in a drawer. I tucked the sleek black lens neatly behind the rearview mirror, angling it slightly toward the driver's side window, and quickly synced the cloud feed to my phone. It felt like a massive, heartbreaking invasion of privacy.
I had never been the kind of wife to snoop through phones or pockets, but the man I had vowed to cherish was actively plotting to destroy my life and leave me with nothing. I had to protect myself. 2 agonizing days passed. I spent hours alone in the house, obsessively refreshing the cloud storage linked to Mark's hidden dashcam. Mostly it was just mundane, boring footage of his daily commute or his car parked in his office building's garage. But on Thursday afternoon, the routine finally broke. Instead of heading back to his corporate office after lunch, Mark drove to a gritty, quiet, industrial part of town. My breath hitched in my throat as the SUV pulled into a narrow, brick-lined alleyway and shifted into park. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, the high-definition camera capturing everything in incredibly crisp detail. A man stepped out from the shadows of a nearby dumpster. It was him, the jogger, the clumsy stranger from the grocery store aisle. My heart pounded so furiously against my ribs it physically hurt. On the screen, Mark rolled down his window. The audio was slightly muffled by the street noise, but the visual evidence was absolutely damning. Mark reached into his center console and handed over a thick white envelope, undoubtedly filled with the thousands of dollars he had withdrawn. The actor smirked, nodding confidently, before tucking the envelope into his leather jacket. "Just get it done this weekend." Mark's voice crackled coldly through the tiny microphone. "Right in the open. Make it look convincing." I slammed my laptop shut, pushing my chair back as a wave of violent nausea washed over me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, sobbing quietly into the empty room. My husband wasn't just falling out of love with me. He was paying a stranger to assault my dignity and frame me. I didn't cry for very long. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his betrayal had completely burned away the last remnants of my naive hope. Instead, I marched straight into the study, pulling down the heavy, leather-bound marital folder once more. I needed to understand the exact weapon he was trying to use against me. I sat at the desk and read the infidelity clause again. It was as brutal as I remembered, a total forfeiture of all assets for the cheating spouse. But this time, I didn't stop there. I read the fine print beneath it. I scoured every single page of the document, tracing the dense legal text with my index finger, searching for any lifeline. And then, I found it. Buried deep on page 14, nestled quietly under a section titled Mutual Protections and Penalties, was Clause 8. I read it 3 times to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. In the event that either party is found to have fabricated evidence, coerced a third party, or orchestrated a false breach of contract to wrongfully invoke the penalties herein, the offending party shall immediately forfeit all marital, business, and personal assets to the victimized party. A humorless, cynical laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet study. Mark was so painfully arrogant, so blinded by his own greed and his desperate desire to discard me cleanly, that he had forgotten the very document he forced me to sign was a double-edged sword. He was digging his own financial grave, believing he was the smartest man in the room. I carefully closed the folder and smiled through my lingering heartbreak. He wanted a performance. I was gonna give him one. Friday morning arrived with an eerie, suffocating stillness. Knowing that this weekend was the deadline Mark had given his hired actor, I went into full survival mode. I sat at the kitchen island, drinking my coffee, while transferring the high-definition dashcam footage and my driveway security feed onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. One went into my purse, one went into my safe deposit box at a different bank, and the final one I tucked safely inside the lining of my winter coat. I wasn't taking any chances. When Mark finally lumbered into the kitchen, adjusting his expensive tie, he looked unusually energetic. There was a sickening, smug bounce in his step that I hadn't seen in months. He whistled a tuneless melody while pouring his coffee. "You're in a good mood," I noted, my voice impressively steady. I hated how smoothly the lie rolled off my tongue, but I was playing his treacherous game now. "Just a great week at the firm, Clara," he said, offering a tight, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "In fact, I think I'll work from home tomorrow. Take it easy." "Maybe you should spend some time in the garden. The forecast says it's going to be absolutely beautiful." My stomach churned violently. He was meticulously setting the stage. He needed me outside, vulnerable and visible, while he waited inside to play the outraged victim. "That sounds lovely," I replied, forcing a soft, agreeable smile. "I do need to prune the roses." He nodded, grabbing his briefcase and leaving without a kiss goodbye. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. The trap was set, but he had no idea he was the one stepping into it. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, mocking the dark anxiety swirling inside my chest. True to his word, Mark stayed home. He set up his laptop at the dining room table, which conveniently offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the front driveway through the large bay windows. Every few minutes, I saw him nervously checking his phone, tapping his fingers impatiently against the mahogany wood. "I'm heading out to the garden," I announced around 10 o'clock, grabbing my gardening gloves and a pair of heavy pruning shears. "Take your time," Mark replied without looking up, though I noticed the sudden, sharp tension stiffening his shoulders. I stepped out into the cool morning air, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I walked down the driveway, kneeling by the rose bushes, acutely aware of the hidden security camera positioned directly above me on the porch. I pruned the dead leaves with shaking hands, counting the agonizing seconds. Then I heard the distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel. I stood up slowly, clutching the shears. It was him, the actor. Today he was dressed casually in a dark denim jacket, looking like a lost pedestrian. He walked purposely up our driveway, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no friendly jogging facade this time. His expression was entirely focused, almost clinical. "Excuse me," he called out, his smooth baritone carrying across the quiet suburban lawn. "I think I'm completely lost. Could you help me find Elm Street?" I glanced subtly toward the dining room window. Mark was no longer sitting at his laptop. The heavy curtain twitched. It was happening. "You're a few blocks off," I said loudly, planting my feet firmly on the pavement. "You just need to turn around." The actor didn't turn around. Instead, he closed the distance between us with alarming speed. Before I could take a step back, he reached out, gripping my upper arms firmly. It wasn't violent, but it was highly orchestrated and completely inescapable. He dipped his head, pulling me awkwardly into a rigid embrace, and pressed his cheek roughly against mine, creating the perfect optical illusion of a passionate kiss for anyone watching from the house. "Hey, get your hands off my wife!" The front door practically exploded off its hinges. Mark burst out onto the porch, his face twisted in a mask of theatrical, exaggerated fury. In his right hand, he was holding his smartphone, the camera flashing repeatedly in the bright morning sun. The actor immediately released me, throwing his hands up in mock surrender. "Whoa, buddy, I didn't mean any trouble," he yelled, sprinting down the driveway and disappearing down the street right on cue. I stood perfectly still in the center of the driveway, brushing off my cardigan. My heart was racing, but a profound, icy calm had finally settled over my mind. Mark stormed down the driveway, panting heavily as he waved his phone in my face. "I cannot believe this, right in our own driveway," he screamed, his voice echoing off the neighboring houses. "I caught you, Clara. I caught you cheating. I have the photos right here." I looked at his fake outrage. the absolute triumph dancing in his deceitful eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had completely destroyed me. "Are you finished shouting?" I asked quietly, my voice eerily flat. Mark blinked, clearly thrown off by my total lack of tears or panic. "You get 0. The prenup is triggered." I didn't give Mark the satisfaction of a screaming match on the front lawn. Instead, I turned my back on his pathetic performance and walked calmly back into the house. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, but Mark threw it open seconds later, his face flushed with manufactured rage. "You're not walking away from this," he yelled, following me down the hallway. "I have the blurry photos right here, Clara. It's over. I'm calling my lawyer right now. You get absolutely 0. Nothing. Pack your bags." I walked straight into the kitchen, entirely ignoring his frantic pacing. The coffee pot was still warm. I picked up my favorite ceramic mug and steadily poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The dark, rich liquid filled the mug, the mundane sound of the pouring sharply contrasting with Mark's chaotic screaming. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, slamming his open hand on the marble counter. "You're ruined. The prenup is crystal clear about infidelity." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. It tasted exceptionally good today. I set the mug down gently and finally looked him directly in the eyes. His chest was heaving, but underneath the fake anger, I could see the confusion starting to seep in. He had expected me to collapse, to beg, to cry hysterically. My total silence completely unnerved him. "Nice try," I said softly, my voice carrying a lethal calmness that made him freeze in his tracks. I reached out and pulled my laptop toward me across the island. I had set it up perfectly before stepping outside. "But you really should have reviewed the security footage before you started your performance." I tapped the spacebar on my laptop, waking the screen, and slowly turned it around so it directly faced him. Mark sneered, fully expecting to see my driveway camera footage. "What is this? Are you trying to prove it was non-consensual?" he scoffed, leaning over the marble island. "The photos I took are enough for any judge to—" His voice completely caught in his throat. The smugness evaporated from his face instantly, replaced by a sudden, chalky paleness. Playing on the screen wasn't the driveway at all. It was the crisp, high-definition footage from the hidden dashcam in his SUV. The video clearly showed the gritty brick alleyway from 2 days ago. It showed Mark rolling down his window. It showed the very same man who had just grabbed me in the driveway, stepping out from behind a green dumpster. The audio was perfectly clear in the quiet kitchen. Mark's own voice echoed from the small speakers. "Just get it done this weekend, right in the open. Make it look convincing." We both watched in absolute silence as the digital Mark handed the actor the thick, white envelope of cash. Mark staggered back from the kitchen island as if the laptop had physically burned him. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The phone, holding his precious, blurry photos, slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. "You," he whispered, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "How did you—" "I've known for days, Mark," I replied, taking another calm sip of my coffee. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice a massive, random cash withdrawal from our joint savings? Did you really think I was that blind?" Mark began to panic. He grabbed the edge of the marble counter, his knuckles turning stark white. "Clara, listen, we can talk about this. I was just under a massive amount of stress at the firm. It was a terrible mistake." The sudden shift from an aggressive conqueror to a begging coward was pathetic. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity for the man standing before me. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, sliding a printed document across the counter toward him. It was a highlighted copy of our prenuptial agreement. "By the way, you were so intensely focused on the infidelity clause that you clearly forgot to read the rest of the document your lawyers drafted." I tapped my index finger right on the bright yellow highlighter marks. Fabricating evidence, I read aloud, my voice steady and unyielding. Orchestrating a false breach of contract. Does any of this sound painfully familiar to you, Mark? He stared at the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the dense text he had proudly forced me to sign 5 years ago. I watched the exact moment his world collapsed. Clause 8, I continued, leaning in closer. It explicitly states that the offending party immediately forfeits all marital, business, and personal assets to the victim. You just triggered it. No, he gasped, his voice cracking wildly. That's not, you can't take the business. You can't take the house. I didn't take anything, I corrected him coldly, closing my laptop. You played a ruthless game to leave me with nothing. But congratulations, Mark. You just forfeited absolutely everything to me. Mark stared at the highlighted paper, his breath hitching sharply in his chest. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and entirely defeated. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain control, he lunged forward, trying to grab my hands across the marble kitchen island. I smoothly stepped back, keeping myself safely out of his reach. Clara, baby, please, he begged, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. You can't do this. We've been married for 5 years. Think about our beautiful wedding in the botanical gardens. Think about all the sacred promises we made to each other. I had a moment of terrible weakness. I let the overwhelming financial stress warp my mind. It was fascinating, in a deeply sickening way, to watch him try to manipulate my empathy. The man who had intentionally iced me out for months, who had cruelly dismissed my pain and orchestrated my public humiliation, was now desperately crying tears of self-pity. You didn't have a moment of weakness, Mark, I replied steadily, holding his gaze without a single ounce of forgiveness. A moment of weakness is snapping at someone because you had a bad day at the office, withdrawing thousands of dollars in cash, driving to a remote alleyway, hiring a deceptive actor, and plotting a fake assault in our driveway is a calculated, malicious campaign. I pointed firmly toward the hallway. I want you out of this house within the hour, I demanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Take your clothes and your personal toiletries. Leave your house keys on the counter. My lawyer will be in contact with yours on Monday morning. This is my house, he tried to yell, but his voice cracked, betraying his absolute powerlessness. Not anymore, I said softly. Clause 8, remember? For the next 45 minutes, the only sounds in the house were the heavy thuds of Mark's footsteps and the aggressive zipping of his leather duffel bags. I stood leaning against the doorframe of our master bedroom, my arms crossed protectively over my chest, silently supervising his hasty exit. I had to ensure he didn't try to sneak away with any joint financial documents or valuable assets that were now legally mine. He carelessly threw his expensive designer suits and silk ties into his suitcase, intentionally knocking over a bedside lamp, in a petty, childish display of temper. I didn't even flinch when the ceramic base shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The loud crash just sounded like the final, pathetic death rattle of our broken marriage. As he hoisted the heavy bags over his shoulders, he paused at the top of the stairs, glaring at me with red, furious eyes. The pleading, begging husband from the kitchen had vanished entirely, replaced once again by the bitter, arrogant man I had grown to deeply despise. You think you're so incredibly smart, Clara, he spat viciously. You think a judge is just going to blindly hand over my entire company to a housewife? I have the best defense attorneys in the state on my payroll. I will drag this out in court for decades if I have to. I will financially drain you until you surrender. I smiled calmly, completely unfazed by his empty, desperate threats. I have 3 encrypted backups of the high-definition alleyway footage, Mark, I reminded him softly, and your own distinct signature on the ironclad prenup you eagerly forced upon me. Tell your expensive lawyers I said hello. He practically choked on his own rage. Without another word, he stomped down the stairs, aggressively slammed his keys onto the counter, and marched out the door. By Monday morning, the stormy, emotional clouds had finally cleared, leaving me with a bright, razor-sharp sense of purpose. I sat comfortably in the plush leather chair of a sunlit, glass-walled downtown law office. It felt incredibly poetic to be sitting in a space so remarkably similar to the room where Mark had initially forced me to sign that oppressive prenuptial agreement 5 years ago.
Across the polished mahogany desk sat Evelyn, a highly recommended family law attorney known for her fierce, no-nonsense approach to high-stakes divorces. She silently read through the highlighted document I had provided, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. I pushed a small, encrypted silver flash drive across the desk.
The dashcam video file, the audio recording, and the driveway security footage are all right there. Everything is perfectly time-stamped and securely verified. Evelyn plugged the drive into her laptop, her eyes narrowing in fierce concentration as she reviewed the crisp, undeniable evidence of Mark's treacherous alleyway transaction. When the actor grabbed me in the driveway on the second video, she paused the playback, letting out a low, deeply impressed whistle. "Clara," Evelyn finally said, taking off her glasses and looking at me with deep, genuine respect. In my 20 years of practicing family law, I have seen spouses try every dirty trick in the book to falsely hide their assets. But I have never seen a husband eagerly hand over the absolute key to his own financial destruction on a silver platter. "Is Clause 8 legally enforceable?" I asked, my heart doing a hopeful, anxious flutter. "With this level of indisputable, high-definition evidence?" Evelyn smiled, a sharp, confident grin that made me incredibly glad she was on my side. "It is entirely airtight." Mark didn't just casually breach the contract. He detonated it. He truly left himself with absolutely nothing. Returning to the sprawling suburban house after my meeting with Evelyn felt entirely different this time. For the past 6 months, stepping through the heavy oak front door meant bracing myself for an agonizing, suffocating silence. It was a silence Mark had wielded like a blunt weapon to punish me, to freeze me out, and to make me feel profoundly invisible in my own home. But today, as I stood in the quiet foyer, the silence no longer felt heavy or oppressive. It felt remarkably like peace. I walked into the living room and knelt beside the shattered ceramic lamp Mark had destroyed during his tantrum. I carefully swept up the sharp, broken pieces and tossed them into the trash bin. As the shards clattered against the plastic, I felt a sudden, unexpected wave of grief wash over me. I wasn't mourning the arrogant man who had tried to destroy me. I was mourning the husband I thought I had married 5 years ago. I sat on the living room floor and allowed myself to finally cry, releasing all the pent-up tension, the betrayal, and the profound heartache I had been carrying. When the tears eventually stopped, a new, resilient lightness took root in my chest. I spent the remainder of the afternoon systematically packing up the last of Mark's forgotten items, his stray golf clubs, the dusty bottles of scotch he kept in the study, and his discarded paperwork. I piled the cardboard boxes neatly in the garage. By the time the sun set, painting the bay windows in hues of warm gold and soft pink, the house was entirely mine. That night, for the very first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. 3 weeks later, the theoretical legal battle transformed into a harsh, undeniable reality. We convened in a neutral, sterile conference room downtown for the initial deposition. Mark walked in wearing his sharpest, most intimidating charcoal power suit. He sat directly across the polished table from me, his posture stiff and arrogant, desperately trying to project the image of an untouchable corporate executive. His lead attorney, a man named Mr. Davis, immediately began the meeting with aggressive, rehearsed posturing, attempting to dismiss my claims as the hysterical delusions of a scorned woman. Evelyn, my attorney, didn't interrupt him. She simply let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then, without a single word of dramatic flair, she turned her laptop around and pressed play. The high-definition dashcam video filled the quiet room. The crisp audio of Mark handing over the cash and ordering the fake assault echoed off the glass walls. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Mr. Davis. The transformation was incredibly satisfying to watch. The expensive, highly paid lawyer physically recoiled. All the color drained from his face as he stared at the screen, quickly realizing that his client had brazenly lied to him. When the video finished, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the conference room. Mr. Davis slowly turned his head to glare at Mark. "You told me you were at the office that entire afternoon," Mr. Davis whispered, his voice trembling with furious indignation. Mark tugged of his expensive silk tie, sudden beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I can explain," he stammered weakly. "We need to take a recess," Mr. Davis announced abruptly, slamming his legal pad shut and grabbing Mark by the arm. The impenetrable armor Mark had worn for 5 years was officially shattered. Evelyn was an absolute force of nature. Even though we had the damning dashcam footage, she refused to leave any room for Mark's legal team to fabricate a defense. She wanted the case to be completely bulletproof, ensuring that Clause 8 would be executed without a single legal loophole. 2 days after the disastrous deposition, Evelyn called me into her office with a triumphant smile. "We found him," she announced, sliding a thick manila folder across her desk. She had hired a private investigator who tracked down the actor within 48 hours. His name was Leo, a struggling local theater performer who frequently took odd jobs to pay his rent. According to Evelyn, when the investigator confronted Leo with the high-definition footage and explained the severe civil and criminal liabilities of participating in a fraudulent scheme to steal marital assets, Leo completely panicked. I opened the folder and read the document inside. It was a legally binding sworn affidavit. In it, Leo detailed every single interaction he had with my husband. He confessed that Mark had approached him outside a local coffee shop, offering him a quick, easy $5,000 to stage a harmless romantic encounter for a jealousy prank. Leo swore he had no idea he was being used as a pawn to trigger a punitive prenuptial agreement. To save himself from any legal fallout, Leo willingly surrendered the text messages Mark had sent him, outlining the exact time and location for the driveway stunt. Holding the signed confession in my hands, a profound sense of closure settled over me. It was the final, indisputable nail in Mark's financial coffin. The truth was fully, entirely in the light, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. A week after Leo's sworn affidavit landed on Evelyn's desk, Mark's formidable legal defense completely imploded. Mr. Davis, unwilling to risk his own professional reputation defending a blatant fraud, formally advised his client to surrender. We bypassed the lengthy, agonizing court trial entirely. We met one last time in the mediator's office to sign the final paperwork. Mark looked like a hollow shell of the arrogant executive who had yelled at me in our driveway. His expensive suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and he couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. Evelyn slid the finalized dissolution agreement across the large oak table. It was explicitly dictated by the strict terms of Clause 8. I retained the house, my personal savings, and, most devastatingly for Mark, a significant, controlling share of the marital assets and his business portfolio. He was walking away with only his personal bank account, a tiny fraction of what he had smugly planned to leave me with. He picked up the heavy black fountain pen. His hand hovered over the signature line, trembling violently. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raspy and pathetic, "are you really going to take everything?" "I didn't write the contract, Mark," I replied evenly, my voice devoid of anger or pity. I am simply honoring the exact agreement you enthusiastically insisted upon to protect our future. Please, sign the papers." He swallowed hard, the reality of his devastating miscalculation finally sinking in.
With a defeated sigh, he scrawled his signature across the bottom of the page, legally sealing his own ruin. I watched the ink dry, feeling a massive, suffocating weight permanently lift from my shoulders. The toxic battle was officially over. I had survived the storm.
A few days after the ink dried on the settlement, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in nearly a year: Sarah, Mark's older sister. We had once been incredibly close, sharing quiet Sunday brunches and exchanging family recipes, but Mark's growing coldness had slowly severed all my ties to his family.
I hesitated, bracing myself for accusations, but eventually tapped the green button. "Hello, Sarah?" "Clara." Her voice cracked instantly through the speaker, thick with genuine emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry. I just found out the truth about what Mark tried to do to you." I leaned against the marble island, closing my eyes as a sudden wave of deep relief washed over me.
I hadn't realized how much I needed someone from his world to validate my pain. He spun this elaborate, heartbreaking narrative to our parents, Sarah continued, sniffing quietly. "He told us you had been unfaithful, that you maliciously broke his heart. But his lawyer finally told my husband the truth about the fraud. Clara, I am deeply ashamed of him. No one deserves that kind of calculated cruelty." "Thank you, Sarah," I whispered, a single tear slipping down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of profound validation. "It means more to me than you know." "You were always a wonderful wife to him," she said softly. "He was just too blinded by his own greed to see it. I wish you nothing but peace, Clara."
When the call ended, the empty kitchen felt warmer. The last lingering shadows of self-doubt, the tiny nagging whispers that perhaps I had somehow failed the marriage, completely dissolved. The failure was entirely his. The transition from a broken wife to a healed, independent woman didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my space and my identity. I started with the house. For 5 years, every aesthetic choice had been dictated by Mark's rigid, sterile tastes. It was time to breathe vibrant life back into my home. On a sunny Saturday morning, I walked into the dark, mahogany-paneled study, the very room where I had discovered the devastating truth hidden within our marital folder. I stood in the center of the room, holding a gallon of warm, buttery yellow paint and a thick roller. I moved his heavy desk out of the way, draped the old leather chairs in protective canvas, and began to paint. With every stroke of the roller, I felt like I was physically erasing the heavy, oppressive memories that had haunted this room. The dark, serious walls slowly transformed into a bright, welcoming canvas. I planned to turn the study into a personal art studio, a cherished hobby I had entirely abandoned when Mark endlessly complained about the mess. I ordered a sturdy wooden easel, bought a beautiful set of expensive acrylics, and started leaving my brushes right on the desk where his cold, corporate documents used to live. As I wiped a smudge of yellow paint from my forehead, I looked out the window down at the long driveway. The spot where my heart had been temporarily shattered now just looked like ordinary sunlit pavement. The ghost of that terrible Saturday morning was gone. The house finally felt like a sanctuary, a true reflection of the woman who had fought so bravely to keep it. The smell of fresh acrylics filled the newly yellow study, a scent that immediately brought me back to my joyful college days before Mark's sterile corporate world had completely consumed my life. I stood before my sturdy wooden easel, holding a palette smeared with vibrant blues and brilliant greens. I wasn't painting anything specific, just letting the colors flow naturally onto the canvas.
expressing the turbulent emotional journey I had miraculously survived. Every single brushstroke felt incredibly therapeutic. I remembered how Mark used to sigh heavily and roll his eyes whenever I suggested taking an evening art class, cruelly dismissing it as a frivolous waste of time and money. Now, my time and my money were entirely mine to manage. I spent hours completely lost in the peaceful rhythm of the brush, entirely forgetting to check my phone or worry about another person's rigid schedule. When I finally stepped back to examine my work, my hands were covered in colorful, messy smudges. The painting was an abstract, sweeping representation of a dark storm breaking into a calm, sunlit ocean. It wasn't a flawless masterpiece meant for an expensive gallery, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever created because it was unapologetically mine. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was a warm, comforting silence. I realized that the crushing, suffocating loneliness I had felt during the last year of my marriage wasn't because I was physically alone. It was because I had been living with a partner who actively made me feel invisible. Standing alone in my bright studio, I had never felt more seen, more alive, or more deeply connected to myself. The difficult healing process wasn't just about moving on from Mark. It was about finally returning to Clara. Taking absolute control of Mark's forfeited assets was a daunting, highly complex task. For 5 years, he had intentionally treated me like a financially illiterate child, purposely keeping me completely in the dark regarding our mutual investments. But Clause 8 had legally transferred a significant, controlling portion of his private investment portfolio directly into my name, and I refused to be intimidated. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit and drove to the bustling financial district. I wasn't sitting in a supportive lawyer's office today. I was walking into a high-end wealth management firm to take absolute control of my future. I sat across from a senior financial advisor named Robert, sliding a thick, organized binder of legal documents onto his polished glass desk. I want to entirely restructure this portfolio, I stated firmly, my voice steady and confident. I want to divest from these high-risk corporate holdings and reallocate the funds into secure, long-term bonds and philanthropic community trusts. Robert looked slightly surprised but deeply impressed. We spent 3 hours meticulously going through every single ledger, bank account, and stock option. I asked sharp, insightful questions, refusing to let him gloss over any complex financial details. By the time the exhausting meeting concluded, I had successfully reorganized the wealth Mark had tried to weaponize against me into a stable, ethical foundation for my new, independent life. Walking out of that towering glass building, the cool city breeze felt incredibly empowering. Mark had built his entire ego around his financial superiority, using it to belittle and control me. But as I confidently navigated the busy downtown sidewalks, I realized true wealth wasn't about the digital numbers on a bank statement. It was about having the unshakable freedom to direct your own life. Spring finally arrived, washing away the lingering, oppressive gray chill of winter. The front garden, which had been the unwilling stage for Mark's orchestrated, malicious betrayal, was now bursting with fresh, vibrant life. I spent my entire Saturday morning kneeling on the soft earth, meticulously planting bright pink peonies and lush, fragrant purple lavender. I intentionally left my heavy gardening gloves inside the house, wanting to feel the cool, rich soil directly beneath my bare fingers. As I watered the fresh blooms, I paused and glanced up at the long, sweeping driveway. I vividly remembered standing exactly there, feeling my world shatter as Mark screamed his fabricated accusations while waving his smartphone. It felt like a lifetime ago. The traumatic memory no longer held any power over me. It was simply a closed chapter in a very long, continuing book. A neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, walked by the edge of the lawn with her golden retriever. She paused, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Your garden looks absolutely spectacular, Clara," she called out happily.
"You've really brought so much beautiful light and energy back to this property." "Thank you," I replied, standing up and brushing the dirt off my denim apron. It took some hard work, but the soil just needed a completely fresh start. I watched her walk away, feeling a profound sense of rootedness deep in my soul.
I wasn't running away from the painful memories of my failed marriage. I was actively growing right over them. I had taken the absolute worst moment of my life, a moment maliciously designed to destroy my future, and successfully transformed it into a stepping stone toward genuine peace. The driveway was just a driveway again, and the garden was a place of beautiful growth. While organizing the deep shelves of the hallway linen closet, I stumbled upon a small velvet-covered box pushed far into the dark back corner. I pulled it out, blowing a thin layer of dust from the lid, and slowly opened it. Inside rested the handwritten vows Mark and I had exchanged at our botanical garden wedding. The thick, cream-colored parchment was still in pristine condition, the ink perfectly preserved. I sat on the hardwood floor, carefully unfolding the paper. I read his promises of unwavering loyalty, deep respect, and eternal partnership. 5 years ago, reading these words had made me weep with absolute joy. Today, looking at the looping handwriting, I felt only a quiet, gentle sorrow. It was the sorrow you feel when watching a beautiful movie that you know ends in tragedy. You can appreciate the good parts without wishing to live in them forever. Mark hadn't just broken these vows, he had actively weaponized them. He had relied on my deep belief in these written promises to blind me to his cruel, calculated greed. But holding the paper now, I realized my capacity to love fiercely and trust deeply wasn't a terrible flaw. It was a beautiful strength. I had simply given that strength to the wrong person. I didn't tear the vows into angry pieces, nor did I cry. I calmly folded the parchment back into a neat square, walked into the kitchen, and dropped it into the recycling bin. It was just paper. The heavy legal contracts, the strict prenuptial agreements, and the broken wedding vows no longer held any power over my spirit. I was completely free from the paper fortress he had built. The rich, comforting aroma of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary drifted warmly through my beautifully renovated kitchen. I was hosting my very first dinner party since the divorce was finalized, and the house was absolutely buzzing with genuine, joyful energy. I stood at the Marble Island, the exact spot where I had once shown Mark the damning dashcam footage, casually pouring red wine into crystal glasses for my guests. My closest friends from college, whom I had tragically distanced myself from during the darkest months of my marriage, were sitting around the dining room table, laughing loudly at a shared joke. And sitting right next to them, smiling brightly and completely at ease, was Mark's sister, Sarah. Our shared bond had miraculously survived the toxic fallout of her brother's deceit, blossoming into a deep, supportive friendship that I truly cherished. "This roast is absolutely incredible, Clara," Sarah complimented, raising her wine glass toward me. "You have to give me the recipe." "My husband will be thrilled. It's just an old family secret," I laughed, walking over to join them at the table. A little extra patience and a lot of fresh herbs. Looking around the warmly lit room, my heart swelled with immense, overflowing gratitude. The suffocating, agonizing silence that used to entirely dominate this home was permanently banished. I had actively filled the empty spaces with laughter, friendship, and unconditional support. The emotional isolation Mark had forced upon me was entirely broken. I had not just survived his ruthless attempt to leave me with absolutely nothing. I had successfully rebuilt a vibrant, beautiful life filled with absolutely everything that actually mattered. Exactly 1 year had passed since that chaotic, terrifying Saturday morning in the driveway. I woke up early, entirely out of habit, and walked downstairs to the kitchen as the golden morning sun began to filter warmly through the large bay windows. I poured my coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, breathing in the rich, dark scent of the roasted beans.
I walked over to the front door, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and stepped out onto the wide porch. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I looked down the long stretch of the driveway. I no longer pictured the hired actor grabbing my arms, nor did I see Mark furiously waving his smartphone, desperately screaming about the strict prenuptial agreement.
Instead, I just saw a beautiful, ordinary driveway leading directly to a safe, loving home. Mark's malicious plan, driven entirely by his arrogance and his greed, had spectacularly backfired, because he had fundamentally underestimated me. He assumed my quiet devotion was a sign of total weakness.
He failed to realize that a woman who fights desperately to save her marriage will fight twice as fiercely to save herself when that marriage becomes a trap. Clause 8 had legally given me my financial freedom, but my emotional freedom was a prize I had bravely won entirely on my own. I took a slow, deep sip of my warm coffee, smiling up at the clear, boundless blue sky. I had lost a husband, but I had miraculously found my own unshakable voice. I turned around, walked back inside my bright, peaceful house, and gently closed the door, ready to beautifully paint the rest of my life.